The first call I made after my divorce became official wasn't to my lawyer. It wasn't to my best friend. It wasn't even to the man I had spent 12 years believing I would grow old with. It was to my father. "Dad," I said, standing outside Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with my army duffel bag still at my feet, "fire every single person my ex-in-laws put in our company." There was a long pause. Then my father answered in the calm voice that had carried me through scraped knees basic training and my first deployment. "I've already prepared the paperwork," he said. "I was just waiting for you to come home." I stared across the parking garage as planes taxied in the distance. 9 months overseas, 1 marriage gone. And somehow that single sentence hurt more than the divorce itself. My attorney had called 15 minutes earlier, just after our flight landed from Germany. "Court signed everything this morning, Emma. You're officially divorced." I thanked her, hung up, and expected to cry. Instead, I felt strangely weightless. Maybe because my marriage had ended long before the judge signed those papers. The real ending had started almost 2 years earlier when my husband Ryan slowly stopped answering my calls from overseas unless he absolutely had to. At first, I blamed the time difference. Then work. Then stress. Military families learn to make excuses because the alternative is admitting the distance isn't measured in miles anymore. By the end of my deployment, our conversations lasted less than 5 minutes. He never asked how I was sleeping. Never asked whether I was safe. Never once said he missed me. When divorce papers arrived at my temporary quarters, 6 months into deployment, I signed them within a week, not because I wanted to, because I realized I was the only one still trying to save something that had already died. As I rolled my suitcase toward the parking garage, Dad pulled up in his old black Ford F-150. He stepped out before I could reach him. Instead of saying hello, he wrapped me in the same bear hug he'd given me after Army graduation. "You made it home," he whispered. "I did." He studied my face for a moment. "You've lost weight. So have you." He laughed softly. "Guess neither of us enjoys stress." The drive toward Fort Worth was unusually quiet. Dad never pushed. He knew I'd talk when I was ready. About halfway home, he finally cleared his throat. "There's something you need to know." I turned toward him. "Ryan's parents didn't just influence him." "What do you mean?" "They've been placing their relatives inside Phillips Logistics for years." I frowned. "Our company." He nodded. "Managers, supervisors, payroll, purchasing. They convinced Ryan they were helping modernize the business while you were overseas." I felt my stomach tighten. "My name was still on board records." "It was." "So why didn't anyone stop them?" Dad kept his eyes on the road. "Because legally nothing they did violated company policy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "They turned our family business into theirs." "They tried." Silence filled the truck. The company my father had spent 40 years building wasn't just a business. It paid mortgages, funded scholarships, sponsored Little League teams. It employed neighbors we'd known since childhood. This wasn't about money. It was about trust. We pulled into my parents' driveway just before sunset. Dad shut off the engine but didn't move. "The termination letters are ready. HR has everything prepared." The attorneys reviewed every file. He looked at me carefully. "But it's still your decision." I thought about every lonely night overseas, every ignored phone call, every lie I hadn't wanted to believe. Then I reached into my backpack, pulled out my Army Challenge coin and turned it over in my fingers. The Army had taught me something simple. When leadership fails, good people suffer. I slipped the coin back into my pocket. "Tomorrow morning," I said quietly. "We clean house." Dad nodded once. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I finally felt like I had come home. The next morning, I walked into Phillips Logistics for the first time in almost 3 years. The building looked exactly as I remembered. The same brick exterior, the same American flag flying over the entrance, the same bronze plaque with my grandfather's name engraved beneath my father's. But something felt different. People weren't smiling. Conversations stopped as soon as I walked through the lobby. Employees looked at me with the cautious expressions people wear when they aren't sure whose side they're supposed to be on. The young receptionist stood so quickly that her chair rolled backward. "Good morning, Ms. Phillips," I smiled. "Please, Emma is fine." She looked relieved. "I've heard so much about you. I'm hoping only the good parts." She laughed nervously. "I think today will answer that." Dad stepped out of the elevator carrying a thick folder. "Ready?" I nodded. "As I'll ever be." We rode to the executive floor in silence. The office used to feel like a second home when I was growing up. During summer vacations, I'd spend afternoons doing homework in Dad's office while he finished meetings. Every employee knew my name. Truck drivers would bring me candy bars from truck stops across the country. Dispatchers taught me how freight schedules worked before I was old enough to drive. I never imagined walking back into the building as if I were a stranger. Dad closed his office door. "I want you to see something." He slid several folders across the desk. Each contained hiring records, promotion requests, salary approvals, family relationships. I opened the first file. The purchasing director, Ryan's cousin, the regional warehouse manager, his uncle, payroll supervisor, his aunt, human resources recruiter, his younger sister. My chest tightened. This can't be real. I wish it weren't. How many? Dad looked down before answering. 28. I stared at him. 28 people. He nodded. Most were hired over the last 4 years. While I was deployed, mostly, I closed my eyes. Ryan used to tell me he was helping Dad manage growth while I served overseas. He'd say things like, "Your father needs younger people around him," or, "I'm just trying to make life easier for your family." I believed him, because that's what wives do when they trust their husbands. Dad leaned back in his chair. "I noticed patterns early. Why didn't you stop them?" I tried. He sighed. But every hiring recommendation came with proper qualifications. College degrees, clean backgrounds, good interviews. They weren't incompetent. They were loyal. Just not to this company. That difference hit me harder than anything else. Competence can help a business. Hidden loyalty can destroy one. Dad stood and walked toward the window overlooking hundreds of parked company trailers. "You know why I started Phillips Logistics?" I smiled faintly. "You've told me 100 times. Tell me anyway." He chuckled. "Because nobody would hire a 23-year-old kid with one truck and big dreams." I joined him at the window. "So I built something where good people would always have honest work." His voice became quieter. "I wasn't protecting money, Emma. I was protecting families. Down below, drivers were climbing into tractors, mechanics were opening garage doors, and warehouse workers were beginning another ordinary day. None of them knew the decisions being made upstairs would shape the company's future." Dad handed me another folder. "This one matters most." Inside were dozens of handwritten complaints, anonymous letters, exit interviews, emails. Employees had reported favoritism, bullying, threats, qualified workers being passed over for promotions. Several longtime managers had resigned after decades with the company. One letter caught my attention. "I miss the company Mr. Phillips built. It doesn't feel like family anymore." There was no signature. Just those 12 words. I swallowed hard. They knew. Dad nodded. They were hoping someone would listen. A knock interrupted us. Our company attorney stepped inside. "Everything is ready." He placed a stack of sealed envelopes on the conference table. Termination notices, access revocations, security updates. Every document had already been reviewed. Every decision supported by company policy. No shortcuts. No personal attacks. Just accountability. Dad looked at me one last time. "I could have done this months ago." "I know, but it had to come from me." He smiled proudly. "Because one day this company will be yours." For the first time since returning home, I understood why he'd waited. This wasn't about revenge.
It was about leadership.
And leadership means accepting responsibility when it's finally your turn to stand at the front. I picked up the first envelope. Let's begin. By 8:30 that morning, every department head had received a calendar invitation marked Mandatory Executive Meeting. No explanation, no agenda, just a conference room number and a time. Dad stood beside the coffee machine while I straightened the stack of envelopes in front of me. Neither of us spoke much. We'd already said everything that mattered. The company attorney checked his watch. "Security is in position." The head of human resources nodded. "IT is ready." One by one, managers filed into the room. Some smiled politely when they saw me. Others froze. Ryan's cousin Jason glanced at the folders on the table and immediately looked uneasy. His Aunt Linda whispered something to the payroll supervisor sitting beside her. Across the room, several longtime managers simply watched in silence. Dad stood first. "Thank you all for coming." His voice carried the quiet authority that had built this company from a single truck into one of the largest privately owned logistics businesses in North Texas. "As many of you know, my daughter Emma returned home from military service yesterday." A few people applauded politely. Dad raised one hand. "Today marks another transition." He looked toward me. "Effective immediately, Emma Phillips is returning to the executive leadership team." The room remained still. I stood. I appreciate everyone being here. I also appreciate every employee who has worked honestly for this company. I paused long enough for everyone to feel the weight of the next sentence. But over the past several years, decisions were made that violated the values this company was built on. Jason shifted in his chair. Linda folded her arms. I continued. This isn't about personal disagreements. It isn't about my divorce. It's about protecting the integrity of Phillips Logistics. The attorney slid the first envelope toward me. I walked directly to Jason. His face turned pale. Jason Reynolds. He looked up. Your employment with Phillips Logistics ends today. What? He laughed nervously. You can't be serious. I placed the envelope in front of him. Company policy allows termination of at-will employment. I've done nothing wrong. You accepted a management position without disclosing multiple conflicts of interest. I was qualified. You were. I kept my voice calm. But qualifications don't excuse dishonesty. The room became painfully quiet. Next came Linda. Then Ryan's uncle. Then 2 supervisors. Then another manager. Every envelope represented weeks of investigation, legal review, and documented evidence. No one was being dismissed because they shared Ryan's last name. They were being dismissed because they had abused the trust placed in them. A warehouse director named Carl stood abruptly. This is retaliation. Dad answered before I could. No. He slid a thick binder across the table. These are audit findings covering the last 4 years. Carl didn't touch it. The attorney spoke instead. Every termination is supported by documented policy violations. Carl slowly sat back down. One by one, security escorted terminated employees to collect their personal belongings. No handcuffs, no shouting, no humiliation, just professionalism. After the conference room emptied, only the longtime managers remained. An older woman named Denise, who had worked for my father for 36 years, quietly approached me. I never thought I'd see this day. I'm sorry it took so long, I said. Her eyes filled with tears. We weren't waiting for revenge. She smiled sadly. We were waiting for someone to remember what this company used to be. Those words stayed with me all afternoon. As the day continued, I walked through every department instead of hiding in an executive office. I introduced myself to employees I'd never met. I listened more than I spoke. Several people thanked me. Others remained cautious. I understood why. Trust isn't rebuilt with one meeting. It's rebuilt one decision at a time. Late that afternoon, I visited the warehouse floor. A forklift operator in his 60s recognized me from years ago. I remember when you used to bring cookies for the Christmas party. I laughed. My mom baked those. He grinned. Your dad always said you were too stubborn to stay behind a desk. He wasn't wrong. Before leaving, he shook my hand firmly. Welcome home, ma'am. For some reason, hearing those words from an ordinary employee meant more than any title ever could. As sunset painted the parking lot in shades of gold, I returned to Dad's office. He looked exhausted. So he asked quietly, any regrets? I thought about Ryan, about the marriage we'd lost, about the people whose choices had brought us here. Then I looked out the window at hundreds of honest employees heading home after another day's work. No, I answered. I don't feel victorious. Dad nodded. I know. I just feel responsible. He smiled. That's how I know this company is finally in the right hands. Neither of us noticed the black SUV turning onto my parents' street that evening, or the furious woman climbing out before the engine had even stopped. By nightfall, my ex-mother-in-law was pounding on the front door. The pounding on the front door wasn't polite. It wasn't hesitant. It sounded like someone was trying to break the door off its hinges. Dad looked up from the kitchen table where we'd been reviewing transition plans for the next week. Mom, who had been quietly washing dishes, froze. Then came the shouting. Emma, open this door right now. I recognized the voice instantly. Carol, my ex-mother-in-law. Dad stood. I'll handle it. I gently touched his arm. No. He looked at me carefully. You sure? I nodded. This is my battle. I walked to the front door and opened it. Carol nearly stumbled inside. She was dressed in an expensive cream-colored pantsuit that looked as if she'd thrown it on without buttoning it properly. Her makeup had streaked beneath her eyes, and her normally perfect hair was falling out of place. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked frightened, but only for a second. Then the anger returned. How dare you, she shouted. You've destroyed this family. Her voice echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Several porch lights came on across the street. I stayed calm. Good evening, Carol. Don't you good evening me. She jabbed a finger toward my face. You fired my sister, my nephew, my brother-in-law, my son's cousin. What kind of person does something like that? The kind who protects her family's company, I answered. She laughed bitterly. Your family's company? She shook her head. Ryan practically ran that business while you were off playing soldier. The words stung, not because they were true, because for years she'd used that same tone whenever she wanted to make me feel guilty for serving my country. Every holiday I missed, every birthday, every anniversary. Somehow my military service had always been presented as something selfish. I took a slow breath. I wasn't playing soldier. I was serving. She rolled her eyes. And while you were gone, Ryan sacrificed everything to keep your father's company alive. Dad quietly stepped into the hallway. No, he said. He didn't. Carol turned sharply. Oh, Robert. There you are. You need to fix this. She walked toward him as though they were old friends discussing a misunderstanding. These people have families. Dad nodded. They do. They have mortgages. They have children. They need their jobs. I know. Then tell Emma to reverse those ridiculous decisions. Dad folded his arms. I can't. You can. I won't. She stared at him in disbelief. I thought we were family. Dad's expression softened. I treated you like family. But family doesn't secretly take over someone else's business. The room fell silent. Carol looked from him to me. You planned this. No, I answered. You planned it. You just never imagined your plan would fail. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Finally, she lowered her voice. You don't understand. What don't I understand? She swallowed. The bank. Dad frowned. What bank? Our loans. She looked down. We borrowed against everything. My stomach tightened. What are you talking about? She took a shaky breath. We expected Ryan would eventually become president of Phillips Logistics. We invested. We bought a larger house. We opened another business. We guaranteed loans. She looked back at me. We built our future around this company. The realization hit me all at once. This had never been about helping my father. It had never been about supporting Ryan. They had genuinely believed the company would one day belong to them. And they had spent money they didn't have based on that belief. Dad spoke quietly. You gambled on something that was never yours. Carol's shoulders slumped. You could still fix this. No. She stepped closer. Emma, please. It was the first time she'd ever said my name without criticism attached to it. You don't have to rehire everyone. Just Ryan's sister. My brother. My nephew. They'll lose everything. I felt a brief flicker of sympathy. Not for the scheme. For the innocent family members who might now face difficult consequences. But sympathy couldn't erase accountability. I didn't cause this. You did. She shook her head. No. You did? You chose your father's company over your marriage. The accusation hung in the air. I thought about the lonely nights overseas, the unanswered phone calls, the divorce papers, the secret hiring, the anonymous employee complaints. Then I answered as honestly as I could. I chose integrity. My marriage ended because Ryan stopped choosing it. Tears filled Carol's eyes. For a moment I almost believed she understood. Then her face hardened again. This isn't over. She pointed toward me. You'll regret humiliating my family. I didn't raise my voice. I never wanted to humiliate anyone. I only wanted to stop the damage. She turned and walked toward the door. Halfway outside, she looked back one last time. You think you've won? I quietly replied. No. I think we're finally paying the bill for years of bad decisions. She left without another word. The black SUV disappeared into the darkness. Mom closed the front door softly behind her. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Dad looked at me. I have a feeling. So do I. This was only the beginning, because neither of us knew that by sunrise, former employees would begin calling with information that would expose far more than favoritism. They were about to uncover years of deception that none of us had imagined. I was pouring my first cup of coffee the next morning when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar local number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. This is Emma. A hesitant male voice replied. Ms. Phillips, my name is Brian Foster. I worked in purchasing until last year. I remembered seeing his name in one of the exit interviews. What can I do for you, Brian? There was a long silence. Finally, he said, I saw what happened yesterday. So did half of Fort Worth, apparently. He let out a nervous laugh. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know why I resigned. I sat down at the kitchen table and reached for a notebook. I'm listening. For the next 20 minutes, Brian carefully described what he'd witnessed during the last 3 years. At first, it sounded like office politics. Then it became something much darker. Ryan's uncle never ordered supplies from the lowest bidder, Brian explained. He always used the same vendors. Friends, family, and every contract was just expensive enough that nobody questioned it. I wrote down every company name he mentioned. What else? There were consulting agreements. For what? Brian sighed. Nobody knew. They were approved without detailed invoices. Thousands of dollars every month. When the call ended, I thanked him for his honesty. Before hanging up, he said something I couldn't stop thinking about. I didn't quit because I was angry. I quit because your father's company stopped feeling honest. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. Then again. By noon, I'd spoken with 8 former employees. By 3:00, 15. Each conversation revealed another piece of the same puzzle. A warehouse supervisor described promotions that had been promised then quietly handed to Ryan's relatives. A dispatcher admitted she'd been pressured to overlook missing inventory reports. A retired accountant mailed copies of expense records she'd saved because something never felt right. Not one person sounded bitter. They sounded relieved, as if they'd been carrying a secret they were finally allowed to share. That afternoon, Dad and I met with our independent auditing firm. The lead investigator, a gray-haired CPA named Michael Sanders, opened a thick binder. We've reviewed preliminary records. What did you find? I asked. He adjusted his glasses. Nothing catastrophic. I exhaled. But I knew there was a but. There appears to be a consistent pattern. He turned several pages. Vendor favoritism. Conflict of interest hiring. Questionable reimbursement requests. Executive travel with insufficient documentation. Dad frowned. Criminal. Michael shook his head. Not necessarily. Unethical. Absolutely. That distinction mattered. I had no interest in destroying people simply because they were connected to Ryan's family. If someone had committed fraud, the law would handle it. But if someone had merely abused trust, the company had to respond appropriately. Justice wasn't supposed to become revenge. As the meeting ended, Michael handed me another folder. You should read this privately. Back in Dad's office, I opened it. Inside were copies of internal emails. Most discussed hiring decisions, budget approvals, routine business. Then one message caught my attention. It had been sent by Ryan to 3 department managers. Emma has changed since joining the Army. She's under enormous stress overseas. I wouldn't burden her with company decisions right now. I'll handle everything until she's back. I frowned. The next email was worse. Don't worry if she questions anything later. She's exhausted all the time, and honestly, she's become pretty emotional. I felt my throat tighten. Then came another. She doesn't understand how business works anymore. Military life changed her priorities. I slowly lowered the papers onto the desk. It wasn't the lies themselves that hurt most. It was how carefully they had been crafted. Ryan hadn't simply taken control. He had quietly rewritten the story of who I was. He'd convinced people I was unstable, disconnected, too overwhelmed to participate. The woman who had led soldiers under pressure was apparently too emotional to understand her own family's business. Dad noticed my expression. What is it? Without speaking, I handed him the emails. He read them slowly. When he finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I always wondered why people stopped copying you on executive updates. They believed him. Dad looked at me. I never did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said something I'll never forget. Emma, betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern. I nodded. Because that was exactly what Ryan had done. He hadn't attacked my reputation. He'd gently replaced it. And somehow, that hurt even more than the divorce. For the next 2 weeks, my days started before sunrise and ended long after dark. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was chasing the truth. Every morning I met with auditors, attorneys, department managers, and longtime employees. Every afternoon another stack of reports landed on my desk. Some confirmed what we already knew. Others surprised us. One thing became painfully clear. Most of the people who had worked under Ryan's family weren't villains. They were ordinary employees trying to keep their jobs. That realization changed everything. One afternoon, our lead auditor, Michael Sanders, laid 3 folders on the conference table. He tapped the first one. Clear evidence of policy violations. Then the second. Poor judgment, but nothing illegal. Finally, the third. Employees who simply followed instructions. Dad looked at me. What do you think? I answered without hesitation. We don't punish people for being afraid. Michael smiled slightly. I was hoping you'd say that. The following Monday, we held another executive meeting. This one felt very different from the first. There were no security guards waiting outside. No termination envelopes. No tense silence. I stood before nearly 50 supervisors and department leaders. I owe many of you an apology. Several people exchanged surprised looks. I was gone for a long time. My military service mattered, but so did this company. I trusted the wrong people, and because of that, some of you paid the price. The room remained completely still. I'm not here to assign blame where it doesn't belong. If you made mistakes and are willing to correct them, we're moving forward together. One manager slowly raised his hand. What if someone signed paperwork because they were told they had no choice? Then we'll review it fairly, I answered. Another supervisor spoke up. What if we reported concerns and nobody listened? We start listening now. For the first time, I saw hope replace fear in their faces. After the meeting, an older warehouse manager named Harold asked if he could speak with me privately. We sat in the break room over 2 cups of coffee. I've worked here 32 years, he said. My father worked here before me. He stared into his coffee. I almost retired last year. Why, I stopped recognizing the place. He explained how longtime employees had gradually stopped sharing ideas because every important decision had already been made by Ryan's inner circle. You know what hurt most? He asked. What? We weren't treated like family anymore. His words echoed the anonymous letter I'd read days earlier. The company hadn't just lost efficiency. It had lost its heart. That afternoon, Dad and I approved a new leadership policy. Every executive would now be required to disclose family relationships before participating in hiring decisions. Independent review panels would oversee senior promotions. Anonymous ethics reporting would go directly to outside legal counsel. Transparency would no longer depend on trust alone. It would become company policy. As we finalized the paperwork, Dad leaned back in his chair. You've changed. I smiled. The Army tends to do that. He shook his head. No. I'm talking about today? I looked at him curiously. When you first called me from the airport, I heard anger. I did. Today I hear conviction. I thought about that. He was right. Somewhere between the divorce papers and the employee meetings, my anger had begun to fade. Not because what Ryan had done mattered less, but because there were too many innocent people depending on me to stay focused. That evening I stayed late to walk through the warehouse one last time. A young forklift operator stopped me. Ms. Phillips. Emma is fine. He smiled. My dad works here too. He's been here 25 years. I nodded. I probably know him. He wanted me to tell you something. What was that? The young man grinned. He said the old Phillips Logistics is finally coming back. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pride, responsibility. As I headed toward the parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was Ryan. The first message he'd sent me in almost 4 months. Can we meet? I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then another message appeared. I need to tell you the truth about everything. I slipped the phone into my pocket without replying. Some conversations come too late. But something in his words told me this one might finally matter. I let Ryan's message sit unanswered until the next afternoon. Not because I wanted to punish him, because I needed to be certain I could meet him without bringing my anger into the room. When I finally replied, my text was only 5 words. Tomorrow, 1 o'clock, coffee. Nothing more. No questions. No emotion. The next day, I arrived 15 minutes early at a small cafe overlooking the Trinity River. It wasn't fancy, just the kind of place where retired couples lingered over coffee and homemade pie. I had come there with my father countless times after high school. It felt like neutral ground. At exactly 1 o'clock, Ryan walked through the door. For a moment, I barely recognized him. He'd lost weight. His expensive tailored suits were gone, replaced by faded jeans and a navy polo shirt. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders no longer carried the confidence that used to fill every room. He spotted me and hesitated before walking over. Hi, Emma. Hi, Ryan. Neither of us moved to hug the other. That chapter of our lives had already closed. He sat down across from me, folding and unfolding his hands. I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't. A waitress brought coffee. Neither of us touched it. Ryan looked out the window for a long moment before speaking. My parents told me you were trying to destroy us. And I believed them. His honesty surprised me. I wish I could tell you I figured it out years ago. He laughed bitterly. I didn't. I waited. He took a deep breath. When we first got married, my parents genuinely liked you. I remember. They respected your military career. So what changed? They started spending more time around your dad's company. He rubbed his forehead. They saw how successful it was. They kept saying things like, "One day this will all belong to your family." I frowned. My family. I know. But they convinced me that after enough years your father would retire and we'd run everything together. He shook his head. It sounded reasonable back then. It wasn't. No, it wasn't. For the first time I saw something I hadn't expected. Shame. Not the shame of getting caught. The shame of finally understanding. Ryan continued quietly. When you deployed the second time, my parents said the company needed stronger leadership. I should have laughed. Instead, I listened. I remembered all the phone calls he'd missed. The birthdays, the holidays, the growing silence between us. Were you ever planning to tell me? He looked down at the table. I kept saying I'd explain everything after you came home. What stopped you? Every month it became harder. Every lie needed another lie. His voice cracked. Eventually I didn't know how to come back. I believed him, not because it excused anything, because that's how deception usually works. It grows slowly until the truth feels impossible to admit. Ryan finally looked me in the eye. I never cheated on you. The statement caught me off guard. I know. You know, I had it investigated during the divorce. He blinked. You never asked me. I didn't need to. He nodded slowly. I guess by then, we'd already lost everything. We sat quietly for several seconds. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small envelope across the table. I found these after moving out. Inside were photographs, our wedding, Christmas with my parents, the day I graduated from officer candidate school. A picture of Dad teaching Ryan how to back up one of the company's trucks just for fun. Ryan smiled sadly. Your father treated me like a son. He did. I betrayed that. Yes. There was no argument. No denial. Just truth. I've accepted another job, he said. Where? A small freight company in Oklahoma. I nodded. A fresh start. I don't deserve one. I looked at him carefully. Everyone deserves the chance to become better than they were yesterday. He stared at me surprised. You forgive me. I thought carefully before answering. I forgive you because I don't want to carry bitterness for the rest of my life. His eyes filled with tears. But forgiveness doesn't rebuild trust. No, it doesn't. And it doesn't rebuild a marriage. He lowered his head. I understand. When we stood to leave, Ryan extended his hand instead of trying to hug me. I shook it. It felt strangely appropriate. Not like two people still in love, but like two adults finally telling each other the truth. As I walked back to my truck, my phone rang. It was Dad. Emma, he said. There's someone here asking for you. Who? You'll want to come. Why? Dad paused. Because it's someone who helped build this company long before either of us imagined this day would come. I arrived at Phillips Logistics less than 20 minutes after Dad called. The receptionist smiled as I hurried through the lobby. He's waiting upstairs. Who is? She shrugged. He wouldn't say much. He just smiled and told me to let your father know an old friend had come home. When I stepped into Dad's office, an elderly man slowly stood from one of the leather chairs by the window. He was tall, though age had bent his shoulders slightly. His silver hair was neatly combed. His weathered hands looked as though they had spent a lifetime working. Dad smiled. There she is. The older man turned toward me with kind blue eyes. So, you're little Emma, I laughed. I haven't been little Emma in about 30 years. To some of us, you'll always be the little girl running through the warehouse wearing work boots 3 sizes too big. I smiled immediately. Frank. He nodded. Frank Donnelly. I crossed the room and hugged him. Frank had worked beside my father for more than 30 years before retiring nearly a decade earlier. When I was a little girl, he used to sneak peppermint candies into my backpack whenever Mom wasn't looking. He'd also taught me how to check tire pressure on 18-wheelers before I was old enough to drive a car. I heard you've had an interesting week, he said with a grin. You could say that? Dad poured 3 cups of coffee. I'll let you two talk. Frank settled back into his chair. I've been following everything from a distance. I'm sorry things got so messy. So am I. He smiled gently. But messes can be cleaned. It's character that's harder to repair. That sounded exactly like something Frank would say. He was never the loudest man in the room, but when he spoke, people listened. You know, he began, when your grandfather started this company, there were only 4 employees. I remember Dad telling me. Frank nodded. We didn't have computers. Half the trucks broke down every week. He chuckled. And your grandfather fixed most of them himself. I laughed. That sounds about right. But do you know what made people stay? The pay. He shook his head. No, the respect. His expression grew serious. People knew they mattered. If a driver's wife got sick, someone covered his route. If a mechanic lost his home in a storm, everyone showed up to rebuild it. No one asked whose responsibility it was. We just helped. I looked down at my coffee. I've been thinking about that a lot. Frank nodded knowingly. Robert told me you've been apologizing to employees. I owed them that. Maybe, he smiled. But don't spend the rest of your life apologizing for someone else's choices. That stopped me. I keep wondering if I should have seen it sooner. You couldn't. I should have asked more questions. You were serving your country. I still trusted the wrong person. Frank leaned forward. Emma, I've lived 78 years. You know what I've learned? I shook my head. The easiest people to fool are the ones with good hearts. I didn't know what to say. He continued. Kind people assume others are kind. Honest people assume others are honest. That's not weakness, it's innocence. He pointed toward the warehouse outside the window. But now you know better. Don't let experience turn you into someone who trusts nobody. Let it turn you into someone who asks wiser questions. His words settled deep inside me. For weeks I'd been carrying guilt I couldn't quite explain. Not because Ryan had betrayed me, because I'd blamed myself for believing him. Frank somehow lifted that weight with a few simple sentences. Before leaving, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me something wrapped in an old handkerchief. I unfolded it carefully. It was a small brass key. What is this? Frank smiled. Your grandfather's office key. I looked at Dad in surprise. You kept it all these years. Frank nodded. Your grandfather gave it to me the day he retired. He said, give this back when someone remembers what this company is really for. Tears filled my eyes. I closed my fingers around the worn brass key, not because it opened any important door, because it represented something far more valuable. Trust. Responsibility. Legacy. As Frank walked toward the elevator, he turned back one last time. Remember something, Emma. What's that? The strongest leaders aren't the ones who never get betrayed. They're the ones who refuse to let betrayal make them bitter. After he left, Dad quietly placed a hand on my shoulder. I think your grandfather would have been proud. Before I could answer, my assistant knocked softly on the office door. Emma, there's someone in the lobby. She says she doesn't expect forgiveness, but she's asking for 5 minutes. I looked up. Who is it? The assistant hesitated. It's Carol, my ex-mother-in-law. For a few seconds, I simply stared at my assistant. Carol, she nodded. She said she'll leave if you don't want to see her. Dad looked at me but didn't say a word. He'd always been good at that, never telling me what to do, just giving me room to decide. I slipped my grandfather's brass key into my pocket. Bring her in. A minute later, Carol stepped into the office. She looked nothing like the woman who had pounded on my parents' front door only a couple of weeks earlier. Gone was the expensive designer suit. Gone was the perfect hairstyle. She wore a simple navy sweater, faded slacks, and sensible shoes. She looked older, not because of time, because of regret. She stopped just inside the doorway. I won't take much of your time. I motioned toward the chair across from my desk. Please. She hesitated before sitting down. For nearly 30 seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked around the office. I used to imagine Ryan sitting behind this desk. I smiled sadly. I know. She lowered her eyes. I was wrong. Dad quietly stood. I'll give you two some privacy. As the door closed behind him, Carol folded her hands together. I owe you an apology. I waited. I don't expect forgiveness. I came because I finally understand what we did. She took a shaky breath. After you fired everyone, the bank started asking questions. Our business couldn't survive. We had to sell the house. I felt a quiet sadness, not satisfaction. Just sadness, she continued. Ryan found a new job. I know. You know, we met? She nodded slowly. He told me. Another silence settled between us. Then she surprised me. You know what hurts the most? I didn't answer. It isn't losing the money. It isn't losing the house. It's realizing I taught my son that success was something you take instead of something you earn. She covered her eyes for a moment. I failed him. For the first time since I'd known Carol, she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't blaming me. She was accepting responsibility. I spent years convincing myself your military career made you selfish. She looked up. The truth, I was jealous. I blinked. Jealous? You had purpose. You served something bigger than yourself. I never understood that. I only saw the birthdays you missed. The holidays. The empty chair. She smiled sadly. I never saw the sacrifices. I felt my anger dissolve a little more, not because she'd erased the past, because she had finally stopped rewriting it. I wasn't a perfect wife, I admitted. There were times the army had to come first. Carol nodded. But Ryan chose dishonesty. That wasn't your fault. No, it wasn't. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. I found these. Inside were several company credit cards that had belonged to family members, along with office keys, building access badges. Everything had been neatly labeled. I thought they belonged here. I looked at the stack. It felt symbolic. Not just returning plastic cards, returning something much larger. Control, pride, entitlement. Carol stood. I won't bother you again. As she turned toward the door, I heard myself say, Carol. She stopped. Without looking back, she asked quietly, Yes, I hope you and Ryan have good lives. She slowly turned around. You mean that? I do. She studied my face, perhaps looking for sarcasm. There wasn't any. I don't hate either of you anymore. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I don't deserve your kindness. Maybe not. But kindness isn't earned. It's chosen. She covered her mouth as she cried. I'm so sorry, Emma. I know. For the first time in our lives, there was nothing left to argue about. She quietly walked out of the office. I watched from the window as she crossed the parking lot alone. Her shoulders seemed lighter somehow. Not because her problems had disappeared, because she'd finally stopped carrying the weight of denial. Dad walked back into the office a few minutes later. How did it go? I smiled softly. I think we both left something behind. He looked at me knowingly. The anger. I nodded. The anger. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Texas horizon, I stood outside the warehouse watching employees head home to their families. Laughter drifted across the parking lot. Truck engines rumbled to life. The company felt alive again. Not because we'd won, because we'd remembered who we were. And for the first time since stepping off that military plane, so had I. A year later, I stood in the same parking lot where everything had begun to change. The Texas sun was just beginning to rise over Phillips Logistics. Drivers were arriving with coffee cups in their hands. Mechanics were rolling open the garage doors. Dispatchers were already answering phones. It looked like an ordinary morning, but I knew how extraordinary it really was. Because a year earlier, this company had been divided by secrets. Now it was united by trust. Dad walked up beside me carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. I figured you'd be out here. I smiled. You know me too well. He handed me a cup. So, 1 year. 1 year. We stood quietly for a moment watching the first trucks pull onto the highway. You've done well, he finally said. We've done well. He shook his head. No. You led. I just helped. I laughed. You're still helping. And probably always will. He grinned. That's a father's job. Over the past 12 months, Phillips Logistics had changed in ways I never imagined. The anonymous ethics hotline had become permanent. Every executive hiring decision required independent review. Employees met with leadership every quarter to ask questions openly. The scholarship fund my grandfather started decades ago had doubled in size. And every new employee spent their first day learning not only how the company operated, but why it existed. Not for profit alone, for people. That lesson had become our foundation once again. The company was growing, but something even more important had grown inside me. Peace. For a long time, I thought strength meant enduring hardship without showing emotion. The army had taught me discipline. Life had taught me something deeper. Real strength isn't pretending betrayal doesn't hurt. It's refusing to let betrayal decide who you become. Ryan wrote me one final letter several months after moving to Oklahoma. He didn't ask to come back. He didn't ask for another chance. He simply thanked me. He wrote that losing our marriage had forced him to become the man he should have been all along. I never replied. Not because I was angry. Because there was nothing left that needed saying. Sometimes the kindest ending is allowing people to keep walking toward the lives they've chosen. As for Carol, I heard from mutual friends that she had started volunteering at a local food pantry. Apparently she'd become the person who always stayed after closing to sweep floors and stock shelves. When Dad told me, he smiled. Funny how life teaches us. I smiled too. Sometimes the hardest lessons become the most valuable. He nodded. Exactly. On weekends, Mom still insisted the whole family gather for Sunday dinner. The conversations were louder now. The laughter came more easily. For the first time in years, home truly felt like home. One afternoon, I unlocked my grandfather's old office using the small brass key Frank had returned to me. The room had been preserved almost exactly as he left it. His worn wooden desk, his framed photographs, his old coffee mug sitting on the bookshelf. I stood there for a long time before quietly placing the brass key inside the top drawer. It had found its way home, just like I had. Looking back, people often ask me if getting revenge brought me happiness. The answer surprises them. Revenge didn't change my life. Truth did. Accountability did. Forgiveness did. The day I came home from my military base, I thought my story was ending. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was the day I finally began living with clear eyes and open heart, and the courage to protect what truly mattered. If my story leaves you with one lesson, let it be this. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Never surrender your integrity to keep someone else's approval. And when life gives you the chance to choose between bitterness and peace, choose peace. You'll carry it much farther than revenge. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone who's overcome betrayal with grace, I'd be honored if you'd share it with someone who might need the same encouragement. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, family, and finding strength after life's hardest moments, I'd love to have you join me again. Thank you for spending this time with me. The end.